Welcome. If you enjoy these stories, please like, share and subscribe. For a bit of fun, comment where you're from and what time you're watching this video. Now lie back, relax and let sleep consume you. The rain lashed down, a relentless torrent that turned the trenches into a muddy quagmire. Water streamed down the dugout walls and the duckboards floated precariously on the rising sludge. Visibility was near zero, the world reduced to a grey, watery blur. I trudged along the trench, my head bowed against the downpour, the collar of my greatcoat pulled high around my neck. The mud sucked at my boots with each step, making progress arduous. The constant artillery fire had churned the earth into a treacherous landscape of deep ruts and hidden pools. Then it happened. One moment I was walking, the next my foot slipped and I plunged downwards. The mud was deeper here than anywhere else, a dark, viscous pit that swallowed my leg up to the thigh. I gasped, my arms flailing for purchase on the slick, crumbling sides of the trench. Panic flared as I realized I was stuck fast. The mud clung to me like a living thing, its cold embrace tightening with every struggle. I tried to pull my leg free, but it was no use. The suction was too strong. Just as I began to lose hope, I felt it, a pressure around my ankle, a firm, unyielding grip. It felt cold, clammy, like grasping something that had been submerged for a long time. My initial thought was that it must be a corpse, another victim of the relentless shelling, buried beneath the mud. The trenches were riddled with them, forgotten casualties swallowed by the earth. But then the grip tightened, not just a passive holding, but an active pulling, a steady, inexorable force drawing my leg downwards. My heart pounded against my ribs. This was no mere corpse. I scrabbled at the muddy sides of the trench, my fingers sinking into the soft earth. I tried to yell, to call for help, but the rain was deafening, a constant roar that swallowed all other sounds. My voice felt thin and weak, lost in the storm. The grip on my ankle intensified, the pulling becoming stronger, more insistent. I was being dragged down, my body sliding further into the mire. The cold, foul-smelling mud seeped into my boots, filling them with its icy embrace. I fought with all my strength, kicking with my free leg, trying to gain some purchase. But the grip on my ankle was relentless, and the mud held me fast. I was sinking, slowly but surely, into the dark abyss. The surface of the mud was now at my waist. I could taste the filth, the acrid metallic tang of stagnant water and decaying earth. The rain continued to lash down, washing over my face, blinding me. I tried to call out again, my voice a desperate, choked cry. But the storm raged on, indifferent to my plight. No one would hear me, no one would know. The grip on my ankle pulled harder, and I slid further down. The mud reached my chest, constricting my lungs, making it difficult to breathe. The stench was overpowering now, a suffocating mix of decay and stagnant water. I closed my eyes, a wave of despair washing over me. I was going under, swallowed by the mud, pulled down by something unseen, something with impossible strength. Then everything went dark. The cold, viscous mud closed over my head, filling my mouth and nose. I struggled, my limbs flailing in the darkness, but the grip on my ankle remained firm, pulling me deeper into the earth. The pressure increased, squeezing the air from my lungs, my ears filled with a muffled silence, broken only by the faint rushing sound of my own blood. And then there was nothing, only the cold, dark embrace of the mud. Later, when the storm had subsided slightly, my comrades noticed my absence. They searched the trench, their boots squelching in the mud, calling my name. They eventually found the spot where I had slipped. A deep, disturbed patch of mud. They peered into the darkness, their faces grim. They poked the mud with their bayonets, searching for any sign of me. But there was nothing. No trace of my body, no sign of a struggle, only bubbles, rising slowly from the depths of the filth. Small, silent bubbles that broke the surface and vanished into the rain-soaked air. They watched the bubbles for a long time, their expressions a mixture of confusion and horror. The rain began to fall again, washing over the disturbed mud, erasing any trace of my passing. The trenches remained silent, the only sound the relentless drumming of the rain. And the bubbles continued to rise, slowly, silently, from the depths of the mud. The order came down with a curt nod from the captain: reclaim the trench. It lay deep in no man's land, a desolate scar upon the earth. We were a small company, weary from weeks in the line, but orders were orders. The fog hung low, a spectral blanket clinging to the churned mud and splintered wood. It muffled the distant artillery fire, creating an unsettling silence that amplified the crunch of our boots on the frozen ground. We moved cautiously, rifles held ready, though for what, none of us truly knew. The trench was supposed to be abandoned, a forward position deemed untenable. Yet a disquiet settled upon us as we approached. There was an absence, a vacuum where we expected to find signs of recent habitation. No discarded equipment, no hastily abandoned rations, just emptiness. The stench hit us first, a cloying sweetness like rotting fruit left too long in the sun, but with an undercurrent of something far more sinister. It permeated the fog, clinging to our clothes, a physical presence that made the stomach churn. We exchanged uneasy glances, a silent acknowledgement of something profoundly amiss. The trench itself was a labyrinth of mud and shattered timber. Duckboards lay scattered, some snapped in two, others submerged in stagnant water. We spread out, each man scanning his section, the silence broken only by the squelch of our boots and the whisper of the wind through the skeletal remains of trees. A sound reached me then, faint, almost imperceptible, carried on the damp air. It was a scraping, a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across rough ground. It seemed to come from the deeper recesses of the trench, further along our line. I gripped my rifle tighter, my senses straining against the fog and the oppressive stillness. One of our lads, young Thomas, suddenly stopped. He stood rigid, his face pale beneath the grime. He gestured mutely towards the ground. There, in the mud, were impressions. Not boot prints, but long, tapering marks, as if something had been dragged. They led further into the trench, disappearing around a bend. The scraping sound came again, a little clearer this time. It was accompanied by another sound, a soft, wet slithering. My heart began to pound against my ribs. This was not right. This was not the silence of abandonment. A shout echoed from further down the line, cut short with a choked gasp. We froze, our eyes darting through the fog. Private Davies. He had been just a few yards away. Now, nothing. The silence returned, heavier, more menacing than before. We moved as one instinctively drawn towards the spot where Davies had been. There was nothing. No sign of a struggle, no dropped rifle, just the muddy ground and the pervasive, sickening smell. The scraping and slithering sounds continued, seemingly closer now, weaving through the fog like unseen entities. Another man screamed, a high-pitched, terrified sound that ended abruptly. Corporal Jenkins. He had been next to Davies. The same chilling absence greeted us. It was as if they had simply vanished, swallowed by the fog and the mud. Panic began to ripple through our small group. We huddled together, our backs to the trench wall, our rifles pointed into the swirling mist. The scraping and slithering intensified, circling us, unseen, unheard, yet undeniably present. The fog seemed to grow denser, pressing in on us, suffocating. The stench of decay became almost unbearable, making it difficult to breathe. I could feel the eyes of my comrades on me, a silent plea for answers, for reassurance. But I had nothing. Only the growing dread and the chilling certainty that we were not alone. One by one they were taken. A sudden gasp, a muffled cry, and then nothing. Each disappearance left a gaping hole in our small circle, a stark reminder of the unseen horror that surrounded us. The scraping and slithering sounds were constant now, a macabre symphony accompanying our slow disintegration. I found myself alone, pressed against the cold, damp earth of the trench wall. The fog swirled around me, a swirling vortex of white and grey. The stench was overpowering, filling my nostrils, coating my tongue. The scraping and slithering were all around me, so close I could almost feel them. Something brushed against my leg, a cold, slick sensation that sent a jolt of pure terror through me. I whirled around, my rifle raised, but there was nothing. Only the fog and the oppressive silence that followed the unseen touch. The scraping sound came from directly above me. I tilted my head back, straining to see through the fog, but there was only the murky grey. Then something dripped onto my face, a thick, viscous liquid that smelled of rot. My breath hitched in my throat. I could feel something near me, something immense and unseen. The scraping and slithering intensified, a cacophony of dread that filled the void. I gripped my rifle, my knuckles white, my eyes darting frantically through the fog. The air grew colder, a biting chill that seeped into my bones. The stench became unbearable, a physical weight pressing down on me. I could feel something watching me, something ancient and malevolent. A shape began to coalesce in the fog, a vague, indistinct form that seemed to writhe and shift. The scraping and slithering reached a fever pitch, a crescendo of unimaginable horror. I raised my rifle, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The shape moved, and I saw... The woods were dense, the trees' skeletal fingers reaching towards a perpetually grey sky. Our unit, weary from weeks in the trenches, received the order with a weary resignation. Captain Schmidt, his face grim under the brim of his helmet, instructed us to hold this position. Deep within the tree line, overlooking a muddy track that snaked towards the enemy lines, we were to establish a defensive line and await reinforcements. We followed his instructions precisely. We dug shallow foxholes, camouflaged our positions with branches and foliage, and set up our machine gun. Days bled into one another. The rain fell intermittently, soaking us to the bone. The promised reinforcements never materialized. We rationed our food and water, the silence of the woods broken only by the occasional distant artillery fire and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Captain Schmidt remained with us, a constant presence, patrolling our small perimeter, ensuring we maintained our vigilance. He spoke little, his gaze often fixed on the track below, a silent sentinel in the desolate landscape. Then came the officer. It had been perhaps 5 days since Captain Schmidt gave the order. The rain had finally stopped, and a weak sun filtered through the canopy. A lone figure in a mud-splattered uniform approached our position. He was an officer, judging by his insignia, though we didn't recognize him. He stopped short as he entered our small clearing, his eyes widening in disbelief. We stood in formation as we had been instructed, our rifles held ready. But something was terribly amiss. Our comrades stood rigid, their faces pale and still. Their eyes were wide open, fixed on some unseen point in the distance. Their bodies were frozen, as if caught in the midst of some sudden petrifying event. Their uniforms were stiff, their skin stretched taut against their bones. They looked like statues carved from ice. The officer stared at the frozen figures, his mouth agape. He then turned to those of us who were still mobile. There were only a handful of us left. Myself, Private Klaus, and young Wilhelm. We stood at attention, our rifles clutched tightly in our gloved hands. The officer, his voice hushed with disbelief, demanded to know what had happened. We remained silent for a moment, unsure how to respond to the sheer horror of what we had witnessed. Finally, Private Klaus spoke, his voice barely a whisper. He stated that Captain Schmidt had given us the order to hold this formation, to remain vigilant, to await the reinforcements. We had followed his instructions exactly. The officer's brow furrowed. He asked when Captain Schmidt had given this order. We replied 5 days ago. He shook his head, his expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. He then informed us that he was from headquarters. He had come to relieve our unit. He asked where Captain Schmidt was now. We gestured towards the frozen ranks of our comrades. Captain Schmidt was among them, standing at the head of our formation, his hand perpetually raised as if signaling an advance. The officer stared at the frozen captain, his face etched with a dawning horror. He then told us something that sent a chill deeper than the cold of the frozen woods through our very souls. He said that Captain Schmidt had died 2 weeks prior, succumbing to wounds he had sustained in the last major offensive. He showed us the official records, a confirmation in black and white. We stared at the document, our minds reeling. If Captain Schmidt was dead, then who had given us the order? Who had been patrolling our perimeter for the past 5 days? Who was the frozen figure standing at the head of our fallen comrades? The officer looked at us, his eyes filled with a question we could not answer. The sun filtered weakly through the trees, illuminating the frozen tableau before us. The silence of the woods was broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant echo of a world still at war. We remained standing, our rifles clutched tight, the mystery of the captain's order and the frozen unit hanging heavy in the air. The whistle had blown, a shrill cry swallowed by the roar of artillery. We went over the top, a wave of blue against the grey of the enemy trenches. It was chaos. Shells exploded around us, the air filled with the screams of men and the acrid smell of cordite. I kept running, my bayonet fixed, the faces of the enemy a blur in the smoke. Then came the retreat, a disorganized scramble back to our own lines. The ground was torn and uneven, littered with the fallen. I stumbled, fell, and when I finally regained my footing, the sounds of battle had receded. I was alone. The fog, a greasy shroud, had descended, obscuring everything. Panic clawed at my throat. I had no idea where our trench was. The landscape was a desolate wasteland of mud and barbed wire, indistinguishable in the gloom. I started to walk, my boots sinking deep into the mire, hoping to find some landmark, some sign of my comrades. After what felt like hours, a figure emerged from the fog. He was walking towards me, a silhouette against the grey. As he drew nearer, I could make out the details of his uniform. It was French, like mine, but torn and stained, hanging loosely on his gaunt frame. His face was pale, his eyes dark and sunken. He made no sound, but raised a hand, gesturing in a direction I hadn't considered. It seemed as good a direction as any. Desperate for guidance, I nodded and fell into step beside him. We walked in silence, the only sound the squelch of our boots in the mud. I glanced down at the ground. My own footsteps were clear, deep impressions in the soft earth, but beside them, there were none. The figure walking beside me left no trace. A knot of apprehension tightened in my stomach. I looked at him more closely. His uniform, though French, was unfamiliar. The cut was old-fashioned, the buttons tarnished, and bearing a crest I didn't recognize. I tried to recall the uniforms of the regiments around us. This one, it seemed vaguely familiar, from stories, perhaps, of battles long past. The figure turned his head, his gaze meeting mine. There was no warmth in his eyes, only a profound weariness. He gestured again, his hands skeletal and pale. He seemed to be urging me onward. We continued our silent march through the fog. The lack of footprints gnawed at me. It was impossible, surely. The mud was thick and clinging. Anyone walking through it would leave a trail. I tried to remember the faces of the men in my company. Had I seen him before? No, his face was unfamiliar, yet there was something about him, a sense of familiarity, but from a time I couldn't quite place. The fog began to thin slightly, revealing more of the ravaged landscape. I saw a shattered tree, its branches reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. I remembered passing it earlier during the assault. It meant we were heading in the right direction, or at least a direction I had travelled before. The figure stopped. He pointed towards a barely discernible line in the distance, a darker smudge against the grey. It looked like a trench. Hope flickered within me. As we started walking again, I made a point of looking directly at the ground where his feet should have been. Still nothing. No impression in the mud, no disturbance of the churned earth. It was as if he were floating just above the surface. A chilling realization began to dawn. I remembered a story an old sergeant had told around the campfire about a regiment lost months ago, swallowed by the mud and the shelling during a particularly brutal offensive. Their entire company vanished without a trace. The description of their uniform, it matched the one worn by the figure beside me. My breath caught in my throat. I glanced at him again. His face seemed even paler now, his eyes darker, almost black. He turned towards me, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. He raised his hand once more, pointing towards the trench. It seemed so close now, a tangible promise of safety. But the closer we got, the more a sense of dread overwhelmed me. The figure began to fade, his form flickering in the thinning fog. He was becoming translucent, like a ghost in the morning light. Yet his skeletal hand remained outstretched, still pointing towards the trench. We reached the edge of the trench. I could see the faces of French soldiers looking back at me, their expressions a mixture of relief and confusion. They called out, their voices muffled by the lingering fog. I turned to thank my guide, to acknowledge the debt I owed him, but he was gone. The space beside me was empty. There were still no footprints in the mud where he had walked. I stepped into the trench, the familiar feel of the duckboards beneath my boots. A small comfort. The other soldiers crowded around, asking questions, offering water. I tried to answer, but my voice caught in my throat. I looked back out into no man's land, towards the spot where the figure had been. The fog was lifting now, revealing the desolate expanse. There was no sign of him, only the churned mud and the skeletal remains of the battlefield. But then I noticed something. Just beyond the edge of our trench, in the mud, there was a single set of footprints. They were not mine. They were smaller, shallower, and they led away from the trench, back into the desolate expanse of no man's land. And as I stared at those solitary footprints disappearing into the fog, a cold certainty settled over me. I knew with a chilling clarity that I had not been alone out there, and that I was not truly safe now. The order came just as darkness enveloped the jagged peaks around us. A night patrol, scout the enemy positions across the valley. A small group of us, 10 men, moved out from the relative safety of our trench, the chill mountain air biting at our exposed skin. The battlefield was a desolate expanse under the sliver of a moon, a chaotic jumble of rocks and shattered earth. The silence, after the day's artillery barrage, felt almost unnatural, broken only by the crunch of our boots on loose scree and the distant whisper of the wind. We moved cautiously, our senses straining against the darkness, rifles held ready. The terrain was treacherous, each step a potential stumble. We kept close, our forms barely visible to one another in the gloom. Then my own voice, faint, carried on the wind, seemingly coming from somewhere to my left. It spoke my name, a soft, questioning tone, as if someone were calling out in the distance. I froze, my hand instinctively reaching for the rifle. I glanced at the others. They had stopped too, their heads tilted, listening. I could see the confusion etched on their faces in the dim moonlight. Then another voice, Corporal Rossi. His voice clear and distinct, coming from somewhere behind us. He called out another name, one of the men in our patrol. A wave of disorientation washed over us. Who was calling us? And from where? We were supposed to be alone out here, scouting enemy positions. We huddled together, our whispers barely audible. Had we stumbled into an enemy patrol? But the voices, they were our own. Then it happened again. This time it was Private Moretti's voice, calling out from somewhere to our right, near a cluster of jagged rocks. He sounded distressed, almost pleading. One of the younger soldiers, barely a boy, started to tremble. The air grew colder, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. This was not right. We decided to move forward cautiously towards where Moretti's voice had seemed to originate. We kept close, our rifles raised, scanning the darkness. Then a sharp cry cut through the silence. It was Moretti, a brief, choked sound, followed by an unnerving silence. We rushed towards the rocks, our hearts pounding in our chests. We found nothing, no sign of Moretti. No struggle, just the cold, unforgiving rocks and the whispering wind. Panic began to set in. The voices, our own voices, calling out from the darkness. And now, one of us was gone. We regrouped, our numbers already diminished. There were only 9 of us now. We tried to make sense of what had happened, but there was no logic to it. Then it started again. My voice, calling out another name, one of the remaining men. It seemed to come from further ahead, towards the enemy lines. We froze, our eyes darting around, trying to locate the source. Then another voice, Sergeant Maggiore Bianchi. His voice, filled with urgency, calling out from somewhere behind us, the opposite direction. Confusion and fear gripped us. We were being surrounded by our own voices, beckoned from all sides. Another cry. This time it was Private Rizzo. His voice, filled with terror, cut short abruptly. We turned towards the sound, but the darkness offered no answers. Our numbers dwindled. One by one, they were taken. A whispered call, a sudden cry, and then silence. We never saw what took them, only the sound of our own voices leading us astray. We tried to stay together, to keep our backs to one another, but the voices were relentless, pulling us in different directions. The darkness seemed to press in on us, concealing unseen dangers. The night wore on, each moment stretching into an eternity of fear and uncertainty. The moon dipped lower in the sky, casting long, distorted shapes across the battlefield. By the time the first hint of dawn began to paint the sky a pale grey, I found myself alone. The voices had stopped. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant chirping of birds. The trench was just ahead, a dark gash in the earth. I stumbled towards it, my body numb with exhaustion and terror. As I reached the edge, I looked back at the battlefield. The first light of dawn illuminated the desolate landscape. It was empty, no sign of my comrades. Then I looked down at the ground. Our tracks, the marks of our boots in the loose soil, were still visible. They led out from the trench, across the battlefield, and then they simply stopped, mid-step, as if we'd been lifted into the air. The trench behind me was silent, empty. The battlefield before me was the same. The rising sun cast a pale light on the desolate scene, offering no answers, no comfort, only the chilling, unresolved silence. The world dissolved into a choking green haze. Coughing, gasping, we stumbled blindly through the trench, the acrid fumes burning our eyes and throats. When the all-clear finally came, the squad was scattered, disoriented. Only 5 of us remained. Karl, Franz, Johann, Stefan, and myself. We needed to find our unit to get our bearings. The trench system was a labyrinth, a muddy scar carved into the earth, and the gas had further obscured any familiar landmarks. We chose a direction, any direction, and started to walk. The trench walls loomed high on either side, slick with mud and water. The air, though clearer now, still carried a faint metallic tang. We passed several fallen soldiers, their faces contorted in expressions of agony, their uniforms covered in the telltale yellow-green stains. After what felt like a considerable distance, we rounded a bend, and there it was. The same mangled section of trench wall where a shell had recently exploded, revealing layers of earth and splintered wood. The same two bodies lying nearby, one with his arm outstretched, the other slumped against the wall, his helmet askew. We exchanged bewildered glances. Surely we hadn't come full circle so quickly. We must have taken a wrong turn. We retraced our steps, choosing a different fork in the trench. This path led us through a narrower section, the walls closing in, the air growing stagnant. We passed more bodies, these ones looking different from the last. One was a young boy, his face pale and peaceful. Another was an older man, his eyes wide with terror. We continued, hoping to find a familiar junction, a sign that we were heading in the right direction. Then we rounded another bend, and there it was again, the same shell-damaged wall, the same two bodies in the same positions. The man with the outstretched arm, the other slumped against the wall. A cold dread began to creep into my heart. This was not possible. We'd taken a different route, yet here we were back where we started. We tried again, each time selecting a different path, a different turn. We went deeper into the trench system, the darkness growing as the sun began to set. We encountered more fallen soldiers, their faces and uniforms changing with each loop. A burly sergeant with a bushy moustache, a slender officer with a monocle, a young recruit clutching a photograph. But no matter which way we went, we always ended up back at the shell-damaged wall, the two familiar corpses, our unwelcome guides. Then came the whispers, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves carried on the stagnant air. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We strained our ears, trying to make out the words, but they were unintelligible, spoken in languages none of us recognized. Slavic tongues, perhaps, or something older, something unknown. The whispers grew more insistent, a constant murmur that seemed to seep into our minds, stirring a primal fear. They spoke of things we did not understand, of suffering and loss, of endless wandering. Hunger began to gnaw at our bellies. Our water canteens were almost empty. Exhaustion weighed down our limbs. We had been walking for what felt like an eternity, trapped in this endless loop of mud and death. The changing bodies became more disturbing. Sometimes we would see the same face, but with different wounds, or the same uniform on a different frame. It was as if the trench itself was shifting, rearranging its gruesome inhabitants. The whispers intensified, becoming a chorus of voices, a cacophony of the damned. They echoed in the narrow confines of the trench, bouncing off the mud walls, filling our ears with their alien sounds. We stopped trying to find our way back. Hope had dwindled, replaced by a gnawing despair. We simply walked, our movements becoming mechanical, our eyes vacant. The shell-damaged wall became a familiar landmark, a grim reminder of our endless confinement. One of us would stumble and fall, succumbing to exhaustion or despair. We would try to help him up, but sometimes he would simply lie there, his eyes staring blankly at the sky, joining the ever-changing ranks of the fallen. The whispers continued, a constant reminder of our isolation. We were alone, lost in a labyrinth of death with no escape. The trench had become our world, a self-contained nightmare from which there seemed to be no awakening. Days blurred into nights, the cycle of walking, finding the same spot, seeing different bodies, and hearing the incessant whispers continued. Our numbers dwindled. Karl was gone, then Johann. Franz simply sat down one day and refused to move. Now only Stefan and I remained. We walked side by side, our steps heavy, our faces gaunt. The shell-damaged wall appeared before us once more. The two familiar bodies lay nearby, but something was different. One of the bodies, the one with the outstretched arm, now had my face, and the other, slumped against the wall, its helmet askew, was Stefan. We stopped, staring at the gruesome tableau. The whispers swirled around us, louder now, more insistent. They seemed to be calling our names. Stefan turned to me, his eyes wide with terror. I looked back at him, and in his gaze I saw my own fear reflected. The whispers grew louder still, a deafening roar that filled the trench. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble. The trench walls seemed to close in, the darkness becoming absolute. And then I saw something else in the mud, beside the body that looked like me. A third figure lying face down, its uniform unfamiliar, its form indistinct in the gloom. Stefan reached out a trembling hand towards it. As he did, the figure began to stir. It slowly rolled over, its face turning towards us. It was me. The scope was my world, a small circle of clarity in the grey chaos of no man's land. Day after day I lay prone in my hidden position, my gaze fixed on the desolate expanse, searching for any sign of enemy activity. The mud was everywhere, a constant reminder of the brutal reality of this war stretching out in a seemingly endless, featureless plain. One afternoon, as the light began to fade, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Through the lens of my scope, I observed what appeared to be faces rising from the mud, just barely visible at the edge of my vision, near a cluster of shattered trees. They emerged slowly, silently, eyes wide, mouths agape in silent screams. They stared directly towards my position. I blinked, my eyes momentarily losing focus. When I looked again, they were gone, just mud. I adjusted my scope, scanned the area meticulously. Nothing. I attributed it to fatigue, the endless hours spent staring through the lens, playing tricks on my eyes. The light was fading after all, and the shadows could play strange games. But the next day, they were there again, in the same spot, rising from the same patch of mud. This time I held my gaze, watching them intently. They remained for what felt like a long moment. Those silent, staring faces, before slowly sinking back into the mire, disappearing without a trace. I blinked again and again. They were gone. I felt a knot of apprehension tighten in my stomach. This was more than just tired eyes. As the days went by, the faces reappeared with increasing frequency, sometimes just one, sometimes several at once. And each time they seemed to be a little nearer. I would see them in the periphery of my vision, those pale, mud-caked features, always staring, always silent. I tried to focus on my duty, on spotting enemy soldiers, but my attention was constantly drawn to those unsettling apparitions in the mud. The vast emptiness of no man's land, once just a strategic zone, now felt like a graveyard giving up its dead. Then the dreams began. I would find myself sinking into a viscous black sludge, the mud clinging to me, pulling me down. I would struggle, trying to break free, but the mire held me fast, suffocating me, and all around me, just below the surface, I would see them, the faces from no man's land. Their wide eyes staring, their silent mouths moving. They were whispering my name, a chorus of faint, sibilant sounds that echoed in the blackness. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the lingering sense of dread clinging to me like the mud in my dreams. The line between the waking world and the nightmare began to blur. During the day, as I peered through my scope, the faces continued to appear, their proximity growing ever more disturbing. They were no longer distant figures at the edge of my vision. Now I would see them just a few hundred yards out, rising from the shell craters, their expressions clearer, their silent screams more pronounced. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the constant shelling was disturbing old burial sites, unearthing remains. But the faces, they were too clear, too defined. And their gaze, it felt personal, directed solely at me. The dreams intensified. The black sludge became thicker, more suffocating. The whispers of my name grew louder, more insistent, echoing all around me. I felt like I was drowning, not just in the mud of my dream, but in a sea of silent, accusing faces. One day, I saw a face rise from the mud just beyond our own barbed wire. It was so close I could almost make out individual strands of hair plastered to its forehead. The eyes were wide with terror, the mouth a gaping void. It stared directly at my observation post, directly at me. I blinked, my hand instinctively tightening on the trigger of my rifle. When I opened my eyes, it was gone, but the image remained burned into my mind. That night, the dream was the worst yet. The black sludge enveloped me completely, pulling me down into an absolute darkness. The whispers of my name were deafening, a swirling vortex of sound that filled my head. I felt hands reaching for me from below, cold and clammy, pulling me further into the depths. I woke up gasping for air, the taste of mud still in my mouth. The dawn was breaking, casting a pale light across the trench. I crawled to my observation post, my hands shaking. Through my scope, I scanned no man's land. The mud stretched out before me, seemingly undisturbed. But then I saw it, just a few feet from our wire. A face began to emerge from the earth. It was the same face I had seen the day before, its eyes wide with terror, its mouth gaping in a silent scream. It rose slowly, silently, until it was fully visible, and then it began to turn its gaze towards me. The whispers of my name echoed in my mind, even in the waking light. And then other faces began to rise from the mud around it, dozens of them, hundreds, a silent army emerging from the earth, all staring directly at me. They were getting closer, the whispers. They were all calling my name. The lamplight flickered, illuminating the cramped interior of the medical outpost. The air was saturated with the antiseptic smell of carbolic acid, mingled with the less pleasant odor of blood and sweat. My days were a relentless cycle of cleaning wounds, changing dressings, and offering what little comfort I could to the endless stream of broken men. Tonight was quieter than most. Only a handful of patients occupied the cots, their sleep fitful and punctuated by moans. I sat at my small desk, meticulously organizing my supplies, trying to impose some order on the chaos of war. Then the sound of an approaching truck broke the stillness. It rumbled to a halt outside, its engine sputtering and dying. I rose, anticipating another wave of casualties from the front. The orderlies began to unload the wounded. There were more of them than usual, their forms slumped and still. As they were carried inside, I noticed something immediately. Their uniforms, they were different from the standard issue, a darker shade of grey, the cut somehow older, more antiquated. Some even wore helmets of a design I hadn't seen before. As I began to examine them, the state of their injuries was even more perplexing. The wounds themselves looked days old, festering and oozing, yet the orderlies assured me they had been collected from the field only hours ago. The stench of decay surrounding them was intense, almost overpowering. I approached one man lying on a cot. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes closed. A large gash ran across his forearm, the flesh around it black and putrid. It looked like an infection that had taken hold weeks ago, not hours. I moved to the next soldier. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the bone protruding through the skin. The wound was crawling with maggots despite its supposed freshness. The smell emanating from it was sickening. What struck me most was their silence. Usually the newly arrived wounded would cry out in pain, would plead for water or morphine. These men made no sound, not a whimper, not a groan. They lay still, their faces impassive, their eyes either closed or staring blankly at the ceiling. I tried to communicate with them, asking where they were hit, how they felt. They offered no response. It was as if they couldn't hear me, or perhaps wouldn't. A sense of profound unease settled upon me. This was not right. These men were different. Their uniforms, their wounds, their silence. It all pointed to something inexplicable. Later, when the initial rush had subsided and the orderlies had dispersed, I went to check the manifest. Each batch of incoming wounded was meticulously recorded, their names, regiments, and the nature of their injuries noted. I searched through the newly arrived names. There were about 20 of them. As I read through the list, a chill ran down my spine. The regiments listed were all ones that had been decimated months ago, their remaining soldiers either reassigned or confirmed dead. I cross-referenced the names with the central registry, a large ledger containing the records of all casualties. One by one, the names on the manifest appeared in the ledger, each entry marked with the same grim notation: killed in action, months ago. I flipped through the pages, my heart pounding in my chest. These men, lying silent and rotting on the cots before me, were supposed to be dead. I returned to the ward, the lamplight casting long, distorted shapes on the walls. The injured soldiers lay still, their silence even more disturbing now that I knew what the records said. I approached the first man I had examined, the one with the festering arm. I looked closely at his face. There was something vaguely familiar about his features, a fleeting recognition that I couldn't quite place. I moved to the soldier with the broken leg. The maggots continued their gruesome work. Undisturbed, I examined his face. Again, a flicker of familiarity like a half-forgotten dream. I went from cot to cot, scrutinizing each face. And then it hit me. I recognized them. not individually, not by name, but by a shared spectral resemblance to the photographs I had seen in old newspapers, images of fallen soldiers from battles that had taken place months in the past. They lay there, these men who were supposed to be buried in some distant field, their wounds somehow fresh yet decaying, their silence a heavy shroud. The other patients in the ward remained asleep, oblivious to the unsettling presence that had entered their midst. The only sound was the drip of water from a leaky pipe in the corner and the faint rustling of my own movements. I stood in the center of the ward, surrounded by these silent, rotting figures, the manifest clutched in my trembling hand. The lamplight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw one of the soldiers open his eyes. I held my breath, watching intently. The figure remained still, his face impassive, but the feeling persisted, a sense of being observed by something that should not be. The silence in the ward stretched, becoming almost unbearable. The stench of decay seemed to intensify, filling my nostrils, clinging to the back of my throat. I looked at the manifest again, the names blurring before my eyes. Killed in action, months ago, yet here they were. A faint scratching sound reached me from the far end of the ward. I turned my head slowly, straining to see through the dim light. One of the soldiers, a young man with a bandage wrapped around his head, was making a small, repetitive scratching motion on the wooden frame of his cot with his fingernails. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but in the oppressive silence of the ward it was amplified, sending a shiver down my spine. I continued to watch him, my heart pounding in my chest. He did not look up. He simply continued his silent, rhythmic scratching. Then another sound joined it. A soft, wet cough from somewhere in the darkness, then another, and another. One by one, the silent figures on the cots began to stir, not with cries of pain, not with pleas for help, but with soft coughs and faint scratching sounds, their movements minimal, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably present. The air in the ward grew colder. The lamplight flickered again, threatening to extinguish. The scratching and coughing continued, a growing chorus of unsettling sounds in the darkness. I stood frozen, the manifest slipping from my grasp, my gaze fixed on the stirring figures. Their silence had been broken, replaced by something far more disturbing. And then one of them slowly turned his head towards me. His eyes were open now, and they were not the eyes of a living man. The silence that descended after the barrage was almost as deafening as the explosions themselves. We lay scattered across the muddy field, our bodies aching, our minds numb. The battle had been brutal, a relentless exchange of fire that had left the landscape scarred and littered with the fallen. As the light began to fade, a sound reached us, faint but distinct against the backdrop of the quiet battlefield. Gunfire. Distant, sporadic bursts, but undeniably gunfire. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the village we had supposedly cleared earlier that day, a cluster of ruined buildings a few kilometers to our north. A ripple of confusion went through our exhausted ranks. The village had been secured. We had seen the last of the enemy retreat or fall. What could this gunfire mean? A small group of us, myself included, were ordered to investigate. Wearily we rose from the mud, our rifles heavy in our hands, and began the trek towards the village. The fading light cast long, distorted shapes, making the already ravaged landscape seem even more desolate. As we drew nearer, the sounds of gunfire became clearer, not the heavy thud of artillery, but the sharper crackle of rifles and the staccato burst of machine guns. It sounded like a skirmish, a small but intense firefight. We approached the outskirts of the village cautiously, our senses on high alert. The buildings were mere shells, their walls pocked with bullet holes, their roofs collapsed. Smoke still wisped from some of the ruins, carrying the acrid scent of burnt wood and something else, something metallic and sharp. We peered through the shattered windows of a ruined farmhouse, and then we saw them, soldiers, fighting in the center of the village, but they were unlike any soldiers we had seen before. Their uniforms were faded and worn, a lighter shade of blue than our own, the style distinctly older. Their helmets were different too, antiquated designs we had only seen in old photographs. They moved with a jerky, almost mechanical quality, their actions lacking the fluid grace of trained soldiers. We watched them for a while, our confusion growing. Who were these men, and why were they still fighting in a village that had been cleared hours ago? We tried to signal to them, to call out, but they paid us no heed. They continued their grim dance of combat, firing their outdated rifles, their forms indistinct in the fading light and the swirling smoke. We decided to move closer, to try and understand what was happening. As we stepped out into the open towards the center of the village, the figures seemed to falter. Their jerky movements became even more erratic, their forms flickering as if seen through heat haze. Then, as we drew within a few dozen meters, they vanished, not with a bang or a cry, but simply gone. One moment they were there, firing their rifles. The next, nothing but empty air. The sounds of gunfire ceased abruptly, leaving a profound silence in their wake. We stood in the center of the ruined village, our rifles lowered, our minds reeling. Where had they gone? It was as if they had never been there at all. The only evidence of their presence was the faint scent of gunpowder that hung in the air, mingled with the metallic tang we had noticed earlier. The scent of blood. We searched the village, moving through the shattered buildings, our boots crunching on the debris-strewn ground. We found no bodies, no discarded equipment that might explain the fighting, just the empty ruins and the lingering smell. As darkness fully descended, we regrouped, our initial confusion giving way to a creeping unease. We'd seen something impossible, soldiers fighting a battle that should have been over, vanishing into thin air. Later that night, back in our own lines, the distant sounds of gunfire returned, fainter this time, carried on the night wind, but still undeniably there. Coming from the direction of the cleared village, some of the men whispered theories, tales of ghosts and phantom armies. Others tried to rationalize it, speaking of enemy infiltrators in disguise, but none of it truly explained what we had witnessed. The following day, another unit was sent to resecure the village. They reported finding nothing, no signs of recent fighting, no bodies, no unusual activity. The village was exactly as we had left it, a collection of empty, ruined buildings, but the distant gunfire persisted, a nightly reminder of the spectral battle that seemed to be perpetually unfolding in the darkness, and sometimes, carried on the wind, we would catch that faint scent again. Gunpowder and blood. The war continued its relentless course. We fought in other battles, saw other horrors, but the memory of the fighting in the cleared village, the soldiers in their outdated uniforms vanishing like mist, remained. A chilling, inexplicable event that defied any logical explanation. And even now, years later, sometimes on a still night, I think I can still hear it. The faint, distant crackle of gunfire, carried on the wind from a place that should be silent, a place where the scent of gunpowder and blood still hangs in the air. The mist rolled in with the dawn, a greasy white blanket that swallowed the battlefield. One moment I was beside Sergeant Davies, the next nothing but swirling grey. The barrage had lifted, but the fog remained, disorienting and isolating. I called out, my voice swallowed by the dense vapour. No reply. I was alone. I started walking, trying to maintain a sense of direction, but the mist played tricks on my eyes. Familiar landmarks vanished, and the ground beneath my boots felt alien and uneven. The silence, after the cacophony of the artillery, was unsettling. Only the distant drip of water and the occasional muffled cough broke the stillness. Then, through the swirling haze, a figure began to coalesce. A man standing motionless, facing away from me. He was some distance off, but his outline was distinct against the grey. Another lost soul, I assumed, separated from his unit like me. As I drew nearer, details began to emerge. He was a British soldier, his uniform the same mud-caked khaki as mine. But then I noticed something peculiar. His uniform wasn't caked in mud. In fact, it was pristine, as if it had just been issued. No tears, no stains, not even a speck of dirt, an impossibility on this ravaged earth. I tried to call out again to get his attention, but the sound died in my throat, a choked whisper that barely registered in the silence. A strange constriction in my chest prevented any real sound from escaping. The figure remained still, his posture rigid. I continued to approach, a growing sense of unease prickling my skin. Something about this was profoundly wrong. When I was just a few yards away, the figure began to move. He didn't turn his head, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. He simply started to glide. There were no footsteps, no crunch of boots on the churned earth. He moved silently, effortlessly, as if floating across the muddy ground. The mist swirled around him, but his pristine uniform remained untouched. My breath hitched. This was not a man walking. This was something else. something that defied the very laws of nature. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. Then an instinct took over, an instinct to follow, to understand this impossible spectacle. The figure continued to glide through the mist, his back still to me. He moved at a steady pace, not hurried, not hesitant. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, navigating the fog-shrouded battlefield with an unnerving certainty. I started to walk, my own boots sinking into the mud, the contrast between my clumsy progress and his effortless glide stark and unsettling. The silence remained, broken only by my own breathing and the soft squelch of my boots. We moved deeper into the mist, away from the direction I thought our lines might be. The landscape around us became increasingly desolate, a wasteland of shattered trees and shell craters. The figure never faltered, never looked back. He continued his silent gliding journey, leading me further and further into the unknown. The mist seemed to grow denser, the visibility decreasing. The figure ahead became a hazy outline, yet I kept him in sight, compelled by a morbid curiosity and a growing sense of dread. Hours seemed to pass. The light in the mist began to shift, indicating the passage of time, but the figure's pace remained constant. My legs ached, my throat was dry, but I continued to follow. Then the mist began to thin slightly. Through the swirling vapor I could see a shape looming ahead, something large and indistinct. The gliding figure moved towards it, his silent progress unwavering. As we drew nearer, the shape began to resolve itself. It was a bunker, or what remained of one, its concrete walls cracked and scarred. The figure glided towards the entrance, a dark, gaping hole in the ruined structure. He did not stop, did not hesitate. He simply continued into the darkness. I reached the entrance, peering into the gloom. I could no longer see the figure. The darkness inside was absolute, swallowing the faint light of the mist. A cold breeze seemed to emanate from the bunker, carrying with it a faint metallic scent. The silence here was even more profound, broken only by the frantic pounding of my own heart. I stood at the threshold, the darkness beckoning. The figure had gone inside. Should I follow? What awaited me in the black depths of that ruined bunker? The mist outside began to thicken again, swirling around me, isolating me once more. The only way forward seemed to be into the darkness. I took a hesitant step inside. The air was damp and cold, the silence pressing in on me. I could see nothing. Then a faint sound reached me from the depths of the bunker, a soft, almost imperceptible scraping. It seemed to be coming from further inside, deeper in the darkness. I took another step, my hand instinctively reaching for the bayonet at my side. The scraping sound continued, growing slightly louder, and then I saw a faint light ahead, a small flickering glow in the darkness. The scraping sound seemed to be coming from that direction. I moved towards the light, my senses on high alert. The air grew colder, the metallic scent stronger. As I drew nearer, the light revealed a small chamber, and in the center of the chamber, I saw the figure. He was standing motionless again, his back to me. The pristine uniform seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. And then I noticed what he was doing. He was scraping something on the wall with his fingernails, a series of small, repetitive scratches. I took another step closer and I could see what he was scratching. Symbols. Strange, unfamiliar symbols etched into the damp concrete. The scraping stopped. The figure remained still for a moment. Then he slowly turned around. His face was in shadow, obscured by the dim light, but I could see his eyes. They were wide and vacant, reflecting the faint glow, and then he began to glide towards me again, silently, effortlessly, across the cold concrete floor. The scraping sound began again, this time coming from behind him, from the wall where he had been standing. I looked past him, towards the wall, and there, etched into the concrete, were more of the strange symbols. They seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light. The gliding figure was almost upon me now. I could feel a coldness emanating from him, a chilling presence that seemed to drain the warmth from the air. His face was still in shadow. I could not make out his features, but I could feel his gaze fixed on me. And then he raised a hand that was no longer pristine, a hand covered in mud, the same mud that stained the battlefields, the same mud that clung to my own boots. The scraping sound intensified, echoing in the small chamber. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow brighter. The figure's hand reached out, closer and closer. I could not move. I could not speak. I could only stare into the darkness of his shadowed face, and then his fingers brushed against my cheek. They were cold, incredibly cold, like touching ice. The scraping sound reached a fever pitch. The symbols on the wall pulsed with a faint, eerie light, and then everything went black. The earth around us was a constant companion, a damp, cool presence that pressed in from all sides. Our lamps cast weak circles of light, barely piercing the gloom of the tunnel we were painstakingly excavating. Pickaxes chipped against the clay, shovels scraped against the loose soil, the only sounds besides our own breathing and the creak of timber supports. We were burrowing beneath the enemy lines, a silent, subterranean advance. Days bled into nights in the close confines of the tunnel. We ate our rations in the dim light, the taste of stale bread and lukewarm tea doing little to lift our spirits. The work was arduous, the air thick with dust and the smell of damp earth, but the thought of the potential breakthrough, the strategic advantage we could provide, kept us going. Then the sound began. Faint at first, a distant echo that could have been anything, the settling of earth perhaps, or the wind whistling through some unseen crack. But as we continued our work, the sound grew more distinct. It was laughter. It was faint, muffled by the earth, but undeniably laughter. It seemed to come from deeper within the ground, from the direction we were tunneling towards. We exchanged glances, a silent acknowledgement of the strange occurrence. Our initial assumption was that it must be the enemy. Perhaps they were digging a counter-tunnel, or had discovered our efforts and were mocking us. We redoubled our efforts, the rhythmic clang of our tools taking on a new urgency. But as the days passed, the laughter changed. It became less human, more distorted. Sometimes it sounded high-pitched and manic, other times low and rumbling, almost a growl. It echoed through the earth, a disembodied sound that sent shivers down our spines. It was not the sound of amusement. There was something else in it, something unsettling. Something that spoke of a profound and ancient madness. We tried to ignore it, to focus on our work, but the laughter was relentless, a constant, unnerving presence in the darkness. Our progress continued, inch by agonizing inch. The laughter seemed to grow in intensity as we neared our objective. It echoed around us, bouncing off the tunnel walls, a cacophony of distorted sounds that made our teeth ache. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the moment arrived. The pickaxe of one of our men broke through. A rush of stale, musty air filled the tunnel, carrying with it a new, even more disturbing odor. We widened the opening, our lamps casting their beams into the newly revealed space. We expected to see another tunnel, perhaps even the enemy soldiers we had assumed were the source of the laughter, but what we found was something else entirely. It was a cavern, vast and echoing, its ceiling lost in the darkness above. The air within was cold, colder than the earth around us, and carried a cloying, sweet scent that made our stomachs churn. Our lamplight danced across the cavern floor, revealing a sight that made us recoil in horror. Bones. Countless bones, piled high in mounds, scattered across the floor, embedded in the very walls of the cavern. They were old bones, ancient bones, bleached white by time and the darkness. Skulls with empty sockets stared up at us. Rib cages lay scattered like broken fences. Femurs and tibias formed macabre heaps. But among the ancient bones there were others. Bones that were disturbingly fresh, bones that still held traces of flesh, dark and glistening in the lamplight. Bones that looked as if they had been stripped clean only recently. A cold dread washed over us. This was not a tunnel. This was not the enemy. This was something else, something far older, something far more sinister. The source of the laughter was nowhere to be seen. But the cavern itself seemed to hum with a silent energy, a palpable sense of something ancient and malevolent. We stood at the edge of the opening, our lamps illuminating the gruesome scene before us. The sweet cloying odor filled our nostrils, mingling with the earthy smell of the tunnel. Then a sound echoed from the depths of the cavern. It was faint at first, but it grew rapidly, filling the vast space. Laughter, but it was different now. It was no longer muffled by the earth. It was clear, resonant, and utterly terrifying. It echoed around us, bouncing off the cavern walls, a chorus of insane glee that seemed to come from the very bones themselves. We stared into the darkness, our hearts pounding in our chests. The laughter continued, rising and falling, a symphony of madness that seemed to emanate from the depths of the earth. We did not move. We could not move. We were frozen in place, our minds struggling to comprehend the horror that lay before us. The laughter showed no signs of stopping. It continued to echo through the cavern, a chilling, unresolved sound that filled the darkness. And then from the shadows at the far end of the cavern, something began to stir. A shape began to coalesce in the gloom, indistinct at first, but slowly taking form. We watched, transfixed, as the shape grew larger, its outline becoming clearer in the flickering lamplight. It was tall, gaunt, and it seemed to be made of bones. The laughter reached a crescendo, a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath our feet. The bone-like figure began to move towards us, its form shifting and reforming with each step. We stood at the edge of the tunnel, the darkness of the cavern stretching before us, the sound of the laughter echoing in our ears, the bone figure approaching. And then the light from our lamps flickered and died, plunging us into absolute darkness. The laughter continued, and then something touched me. The rhythm of the battery had become a part of us. The thunder of our own guns a familiar constant against the backdrop of the wider war. We worked as one, loading, aiming, firing, the recoil a familiar jolt against our shoulders. Days blurred into weeks in the deafening symphony of the artillery. Then a new sound intruded, distant at first, almost lost in the general cacophony, but distinct. The unmistakable whine of an incoming shell. We braced, instinctively ducking our heads, waiting for the inevitable impact, but it never came. The whine faded, then returned, the same rising pitch, the same Doppler effect as it approached. It was as if the shell was caught in some invisible current, forever drawing nearer but never arriving. We looked at each other, bewildered. A dud, perhaps, but the sound continued, looping endlessly, a phantom shell forever on its way. With each passing day, the sound grew. What was once a distant whine became a piercing shriek, a constant presence that grated on our nerves. Sleep became a luxury, punctuated by the unending approach of the unseen projectile. Our conversations dwindled, replaced by a shared, unspoken anxiety. Some of the men began to crack. Private Dubois swore he could hear voices within the whine, faint whispers carried on the wind of the approaching shell. We dismissed it as fatigue, the strain of the constant noise playing tricks on his mind, but then Corporal Lefebvre started claiming the same thing. He insisted the voices were calling his name, a soft, sibilant murmur woven into the fabric of the approaching sound. He would stare into the distance, his face pale and drawn, as if listening intently to something none of the rest of us could quite discern. The sound continued its relentless approach, growing louder still. It filled our waking hours, invaded our dreams. It was a constant, inescapable reminder of an impending doom that never arrived. Then the disappearances began. Private Dubois was the first to go. One morning his cot was empty, his rifle and gear were still there, neatly placed. No one had seen or anything. He was simply gone. We searched the area, our anxiety growing, but found no trace. We tried to rationalize it. Perhaps he had wandered off in a daze, disoriented by the constant noise, but the feeling that something far more sinister was at play began to take root. A few days later, Corporal Lefebvre vanished. Just like Dubois, his belongings remained, but he was nowhere to be found. The sound of the approaching shell seemed to intensify after his disappearance, the whine a little sharper, the whispers within it a little clearer, or so some of the remaining men claimed. Fear began to grip us. The unending sound, the inexplicable disappearances, it was as if some unseen force was at work, targeting us one by one. We huddled together, our nerves frayed, the constant approach of the phantom shell our only companion. The days continued to pass, each one marked by the ever-increasing volume of the approaching sound. It was almost deafening now, a constant piercing shriek that made our teeth ache and our heads pound. Another man vanished. Sergeant Major Dubois, a veteran who had seen his share of battles, simply wasn't there one morning. His absence amplified the growing terror among us. We were dwindling, picked off by something we couldn't see, couldn't fight. The remaining members of the battery grew withdrawn, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. We barely spoke, the unending sound filling the void where conversation used to be. We tried to maintain our duties, loading and firing our guns, but our movements were sluggish, our focus fractured. The sound of the approaching shell was almost unbearable now. It felt as if it was right on top of us, a deafening shriek that vibrated through our very bones. Some of the men covered their ears, their faces contorted in agony. I could almost make out the whispers now, woven into the fabric of the sound. They were faint, sibilant, just at the edge of my hearing. Were they calling my name too? Another disappearance. This time it was young Pierre, barely more than a boy. His vanishing left only a handful of us. The terror was a tangible thing now, a suffocating blanket that enveloped us. The sound of the approaching shell was deafening, all-encompassing. It felt as if the air itself was vibrating with its intensity. I could definitely hear the whispers now, a chorus of voices murmuring just beyond my comprehension. I looked at the faces of the remaining men. They were pale and drawn, their eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. We were the last ones. The sound was so loud now it felt like it was inside my head. The whispers were clear, more insistent. I could almost make out the words. Then one of the remaining men, his eyes wide with a vacant stare, simply stood up and walked away. He walked towards the sound, towards the unseen shell that never landed. He didn't look back. He just kept walking, his figure disappearing into the haze of the battlefield. Now only two of us remained. The sound was deafening. The whispers a constant murmur in my ears. I looked at the other soldier, his face a mask of terror. He looked back at me, his eyes pleading. The sound was unbearable. The whispers were all around me, calling my name, insistent, beckoning. The other soldier stood up. He didn't look at me. He simply started to walk towards the sound. Now I am alone. The sound is deafening. The whispers a constant chorus in my ears, calling my name. The phantom shell is almost upon me. I can hear the whispers clearly now. They are all around me. They are calling my name. They are getting closer. The sound is deafening. The whispers, they are here. The farmhouse offered scant protection from the elements, its walls riddled with holes, its roof partially collapsed. Still, after days of relentless rain and the constant threat of shelling, it was a welcome sight. Our unit, a small detachment of weary Americans, settled in, finding what dry spots we could. A fire crackled in the hearth, offering a meagre warmth against the damp chill. Late that night, as the firelight danced on the crumbling walls, he appeared. A lone figure emerging from the gloom beyond the doorway. He wore the uniform of an American infantryman, soaked and mud-splattered, his face gaunt and etched with exhaustion. He claimed he'd been separated from his battalion during the last push and had been wandering for days. We offered him what little food we had left, hardtack and some lukewarm coffee. He declined, shaking his head silently. He didn't offer an explanation, just a weary look in his eyes. We didn't press him. Everyone reacted to the strain in their own way. He found a spot near the edge of the firelight, just beyond the circle of warmth, and sat down, his back against the cold stone wall. He didn't speak, didn't interact with the rest of us. He simply sat there, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. As the night wore on, we took turns keeping watch. I noticed he never slept. While the rest of us dozed fitfully, he remained awake, his form a silent silhouette in the periphery of the firelight. His eyes, when I glanced at him, seemed to reflect the flames without truly seeing them. The next day his behavior continued. He never ate when we shared our meager rations. He never slept, even when given the opportunity. He remained on the fringes, a silent observer. His uniform, despite the days he claimed to have been wandering, never seemed to dry completely, always bearing a damp sheen. A disquiet began to spread among us. His silence, his refusal to eat or sleep, his constant presence at the edge of our awareness. It all contributed to an unsettling feeling. We exchanged glances, unspoken questions passing between us. Who was this man? We tried to engage him, asking about his unit, his experiences. He would offer only vague, monosyllabic answers, his voice low and almost toneless. He revealed nothing concrete, nothing that could be corroborated. Days turned into nights in the ruined farmhouse. The rain continued, the war raged on in the distance, and the silent soldier remained our constant companion. His presence became a fixture, an accepted strangeness that we tried not to dwell on too much. Then came the morning when we found his uniform. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving the farmhouse in a dim, grey light. One of the men, Private Miller, woke and stretched, his gaze falling upon the spot where the lone soldier usually sat. The uniform was there, folded neatly on the dusty floor, just beyond the reach of the dying embers. The jacket was buttoned, the trousers creased. His boots were placed beside it, side by side. But there was no one inside the uniform. We stared at the empty clothes, a collective gasp rising in the stillness of the morning. The blanket he had used was folded beside the uniform. Everything was in order, as if he had simply stepped out of his clothes. We searched the farmhouse, every nook and cranny. We ventured out into the rain-soaked fields surrounding it, calling his name. There was no sign of him, no footprints in the mud leading away from the farmhouse. Nothing. His rifle was gone. That was the only thing missing. We stood in the main room, staring at the neatly folded uniform on the floor. The silence in the farmhouse was heavier now, imbued with a chilling mystery. Where had he gone? How could he have vanished without a trace, leaving only his empty clothes behind? The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the oppressive stillness. The rain continued to fall outside, drumming against the broken windows. We looked at each other, our faces pale and drawn. The questions remained unanswered, hanging in the air like the lingering scent of smoke. The war continued, oblivious to the strange event that had unfolded in the bombed-out farmhouse. We would eventually move on, rejoin our unit and continue the fight. But the image of the empty uniform, laid out so neatly on the dusty floor, would remain. A silent testament to something inexplicable, something that defied logic and understanding. The rain kept falling, the fire continued to burn low, and the mystery of the vanished soldier and his empty uniform remained. The barrage had been relentless, tearing through our lines. We were ordered to fall back, a chaotic scramble across the churned earth. The air was thick with smoke and the cries of the wounded. We ran, our boots sinking into the mud, seeking any semblance of cover. As we retreated, Sergeant Muller pointed towards a slight rise in the ground. Half hidden amongst the shattered trees, we spotted it. A low, concrete structure, unmarked and seemingly untouched by the shelling. A bunker. It offered the only immediate shelter. We scrambled towards it. A small group of weary, dirt-stained soldiers. The entrance was a heavy steel door, slightly ajar. Muller pushed it open and we filed inside, grateful for the sudden respite from the chaos outside. The interior was surprisingly spacious. Unlike the cramped dugouts we were used to, this bunker had high ceilings and several rooms branching off from the main area. Our lamps cast beams across a scene that was both welcome and unsettling. Stacked neatly against the walls were crates of rations, ammunition boxes, and medical supplies. Everything looked relatively new, untouched by the elements. It was a veritable treasure trove in this desolate landscape. After a moment of stunned silence, we began to explore. The main room led to a series of smaller chambers. In one, we found cots with clean blankets. In another, a small generator hummed quietly, powering a few bare light bulbs, a luxury we hadn't seen in months. As we ventured deeper, however, a disquiet began to settle upon us. We hadn't seen any signs of recent habitation, no discarded equipment, no personal belongings, just the neatly arranged supplies. It was as if the bunker had been stocked and then simply abandoned. We tried to find another way out, a secondary exit, but there was none. The only opening was the steel door we had entered through. The concrete walls were solid, unbroken. A sense of confinement began to creep in. In one of the larger rooms, we found them. Lining the walls, hanging limply from crude wooden pegs, were uniforms. Old uniforms, not just German ones, but British, French, even what looked like Austro-Hungarian. They were faded and worn, some riddled with holes, others stained with what looked like dried blood. The sight was unsettling. Why would uniforms from so many different armies be here in an unmarked German bunker? It made no sense. As we continued our exploration, a faint odor began to permeate the air. It was subtle at first, a musty smell like old earth. But as we moved further into the bunker, it grew stronger, taking on a cloying sweetness, a scent that hinted at something far more unpleasant, something long dead. We followed the smell, our lamps illuminating the dark corners of the bunker. It seemed to emanate from a room at the very end of a long corridor. The door to this room was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible within. Muller pushed the door open wider. The smell hit us with full force, a wave of nauseating sweetness that made us gag. We raised our lamps, their beams cutting through the gloom. The room was empty, just bare concrete walls and a dirt floor. But the smell, it was overpowering. It seemed to seep from the very fabric of the bunker itself. We searched the room thoroughly, but found nothing to explain the odor. No bodies, no remains, just the pervasive, sickening scent. We retreated from the room, the smell clinging to our clothes, our nostrils. The initial relief of finding shelter had long since faded, replaced by a gnawing unease. This bunker was not a sanctuary, it was something else, something strange and inexplicable. We gathered back in the main room, the light bulbs casting a weak glow on our faces. The generator continued its quiet hum, a stark contrast to the growing tension among us. We tried the steel door again, but it was jammed shut. We pushed and heaved, but it wouldn't budge. We were trapped. The scent of decay seemed to be spreading, permeating the entire bunker now. The old uniforms on the walls seemed to watch us with hollow eyes. The silence, apart from the hum of the generator, was profound and unsettling. We sat in the dim light, our rifles held close, our senses on high alert. The bunker, which had initially offered refuge, now felt like a tomb. The source of the supplies, the uniforms, the smell, all remained a mystery. As the hours passed, a new sound began to emerge from the depths of the bunker, a faint scratching like something dragging itself across the concrete floor. It seemed to come from one of the rooms we hadn't fully explored, deeper within the structure. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It echoed through the bunker, a chilling counterpoint to the hum of the generator. We exchanged nervous glances. What was making that sound? Muller gestured and we rose, our rifles ready. We moved cautiously down the corridor towards the source of the scratching. The sound led us to another steel door, this one closed. The scratching was louder on the other side, accompanied by a faint, wet, dragging sound. Muller slowly reached for the handle, his hand trembling slightly. He hesitated for a moment, then pulled the door open. The darkness within was absolute. The scratching and dragging sounds stopped abruptly. We raised our lamps, their beams cutting through the blackness. The room was long and narrow, and at the far end something moved. A shape, indistinct in the gloom, began to rise from the floor. The scratching sound started again, and then the shape began to move towards us silently, effortlessly, across the cold concrete floor. The scent of decay was overpowering here. The shape drew nearer, its outline becoming clearer in the weak lamplight. It was tall, gaunt, and it seemed to be dragging something behind it. The scratching sound was coming from whatever it was dragging. The shape continued to approach, its form becoming more defined. It was a figure, humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head too small, and then I saw its face, or what remained of it. The scratching sound intensified as the figure drew closer. It was dragging a uniform, an old faded uniform, like the ones hanging on the walls. The figure stopped just a few feet away, its vacant eyes fixed on us. The scratching sound ceased. The figure raised its head slightly, and a faint rattling sound escaped its throat. Then it reached out a long skeletal finger towards me. The stones of the ruined church tower offered a commanding view. From my perch, the ravaged landscape stretched out before me, a desolate tapestry of mud and shattered earth. The British lines were visible in the distance, a network of trenches snaking across the barren ground. My rifle, a Mauser Gewehr 98, felt familiar and reassuring in my hands. Each shot was a calculation, a precise execution. The morning mist clung to the ground, partially obscuring the figures moving in the enemy trenches. Through my scope, I identified a supply detail, their forms indistinct in the haze. I settled the crosshairs on the nearest man, a fleeting glimpse of his helmet the only target. The shot echoed across the ravaged landscape, one less. Throughout the day, I continued my grim work. A sentry pacing his post, a group huddled around a makeshift fire, an officer barking orders. Each fell victim to my carefully aimed rounds. The silence that followed each shot was profound, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery. As the afternoon wore on, a particular figure caught my attention, an officer, judging by his uniform, though it was caked in mud from head to toe. He moved with a strange gait, almost a shuffle, through the British trench. I lined up the shot, aiming for the center of his chest. The rifle bucked against my shoulder. Through the scope, I saw the impact, a puff of mud erupting from his tunic. He stumbled, but did not fall. He simply continued his shambling progress as if nothing had happened. I adjusted my aim, this time targeting his head. Another shot rang out. Again the impact was visible, a spray of mud and something darker, yet the officer remained standing. He turned his head slowly, his face obscured by the grime. I could not see his eyes, but I could sense them, fixed in my direction. A cold dread prickled my skin. Later that day, as the light began to fade, I observed the same officer in a completely different section of the trench. He was further to the left, near a destroyed dugout. How could he have moved so quickly, so silently, across such open ground without being seen? I dismissed it as a trick of the light, the fatigue playing on my eyes. I took another shot, almost out of disbelief. This time I aimed carefully at his leg. The impact was undeniable, the officer's leg buckling beneath him. He sank to his knees, his head bowed. I watched, expecting him to fall, to succumb to the wound. But after a moment he pushed himself back up, his limp now more pronounced, but still moving. The following morning the fog was even denser. Visibility was severely limited. Yet through the swirling mist I saw him again. The same officer, his uniform still coated in mud, his gait still that unsettling shuffle. He was much closer this time, almost directly opposite my position, though across the expanse of no man's land. I fired immediately, a desperate shot fueled by a growing unease. The bullet struck him squarely in the chest. I saw the impact, the way his tunic ripped. He staggered back a step, then stopped. He raised his head. Even through the fog and the distance I could perceive his gaze. Those eyes, they seemed to pierce through the mist, through the stone of the tower, directly into me. They were devoid of any discernible emotion. Days turned into weeks. The routine of sniping continued, but my focus had narrowed. The other British soldiers became almost peripheral. My attention was solely on the officer. He appeared everywhere. Sometimes in the trenches directly opposite, sometimes further down the line, even occasionally venturing out into no man's land itself. Each time I saw him, I fired. Headshots, chest shots, limb shots, I tried everything. I saw the impacts, the mud and fabric flying, sometimes even what looked like blood, but he never fell. He never reacted with pain or fear. He simply continued his relentless, shuffling progress. My comrades began to notice my preoccupation. They saw me staring through my scope for hours, muttering to myself. They asked what I was looking at, but I could not explain. How could I describe the impossible? One evening, as dusk settled over the ravaged landscape, I saw him again. He was standing in the middle of no man's land, directly in front of the barbed wire. The setting sun cast long, distorted shapes across the mud. He stood perfectly still, facing my position. I raised my rifle, my hands trembling slightly. This was madness. This could not be real. But through the scope I saw him clearly. His uniform, the mud, that unsettling stillness. I fired. The bullet struck him in the head. I saw the impact, a dark spray against the fading light. He did not move. I watched for what felt like an eternity. The sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness began to creep across the land. He remained standing, a solitary figure silhouetted against the twilight sky. The next morning I was relieved by another sniper. I stumbled back to our lines, exhausted and unnerved. I tried to put the officer out of my mind, to focus on the familiar routines of the war. But his image was burned into my memory. A few days later we received orders to advance. Our objective was the very section of the British line where I had seen the officer so many times. As we moved forward through the shattered landscape, a sense of dread washed over me. The fog was thick, clinging to the ground like a shroud. We reached the British trenches. They were deserted. No bodies, no equipment, just emptiness. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip of water and the whisper of the wind. Then I saw him. Standing in a collapsed dugout, his uniform caked in mud, his eyes. I could see his eyes now. They were fixed on me, devoid of any light, any emotion. He simply stood there, unmoving, as we advanced further into the trench. My rifle felt useless in my hands. My blood ran cold. The other soldiers moved past him, seemingly oblivious, but I could not. I stopped, staring at the figure in the dugout. He remained there, his gaze locked on mine. A cold, slick sensation brushed against my hand. I looked down. My hand was covered in mud, the same mud that caked his uniform, the same mud that seemed to cling to everything in this cursed place. I looked back at the dugout. He was still there. Then he took a step, and another. He began to move towards me, his shuffling gait echoing in the silence. I could not move, I could not speak, I could only stare as he drew nearer, his mud-caked form growing larger, his empty eyes fixed on mine. He reached out a hand.